As witches, we have a unique way that we can do our shadow work that those in the mundane world don't have. For those of us who work with deities, working with them in our shadow work practice can be a powerful and transformative experience. And while any deity can be used during your shadow work, there are some that are particularly aligned with that energy of digging deep into the unconscious to see what's there. So, in tonight's episode, I am going to share with you 7 deities that I especially like when on my own shadow work journey. So, merry meet, I'm Aislin. This is Ask Aislin. Like I said, I'm here tonight. I'm sharing 7 deities for your shadow work. So, if you're here with me live, welcome. Feel free to leave questions and comments in the chat. There's a Q&A at the end, and I will get to those. The questions don't have to be specific about deities and shadow work. They can be about anything related to witchcraft, shadow work, energy work, etc. And if you like what you hear at any time during the video, make sure you leave a heart or a thumbs up. This just helps us get this into the feed of more people. And if you're watching back later in YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the future episodes. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. There's a lot to talk about tonight. I'm sharing with you 7 of my personal favorite deities that I work with or I've worked with our Shadow Work membership, Shadow Seekers. And I do want to just preface this with this. My list of 7 is not all inclusive. So if one of your favorites isn't on the list, it's okay. It doesn't mean that that's not a good deity to work with during shadow work. If you actually end up really liking this video, leave comments and some thumbs up and hearts, because I will go ahead and I'll make another episode like this with 7 more deities in the future. All right, so I'm going to dive right in saying hi to those who are in the chat. I see Cindy and Melinda. Hi, everybody. So I am going to begin with Kali. She's one of my personal favorites. I've been working with her for years. Now, Kali is a Hindu goddess. She's the goddess of power and destruction, time. In fact, her name translates from the word Kala or Kala, which means time in Sanskrit. So she is a manifestation of Shakti energy. Shakti energy is the divine feminine energy. Now, her origin story is very interesting, and I always like to tell it because it gives you a good idea of how we can work with that energy in our shadow work. So, when Kali was born, so to speak, there was this great battle that was raging between the other 3 gods, the other main gods, Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, and they were fighting a demon named Raktabija. Now, Raktabija had a special power in that which, when his blood fell to the earth, a clone of him or a replicated version of him would spring up out of the earth. And so, as the gods were trying to fight this great demon, and they would slash him with their swords or whatever, his blood would fall to the earth, and more of these demons were popping up until there was like millions of Raktabijas. And the gods fought valiantly, but at some point they kind of started to think this might be it. They were being overcome by these replicated versions of this demon. And so just in that moment, when it felt like all hope was lost, they drew all of their Shakti energy together. That's their divine feminine energy. And they created Kali. And Kali sprung forth out of that place, and all of her beauty and all of her rage and her power. And she kind of assessed the situation, in which she noticed is that the blood, when it would fall to the ground, he would spring forth another replicated version of himself. And so what she did, in some versions, she catches the blood in bowls before it hits the ground. In some, she simply drinks it before it hits the ground. And then she's able to slay those demons one by one by one until there's only one left, the original Raktabija. She slays him, catches his blood in a bowl, drinks it down. This is why you sometimes see pictures of her, imagery of her with blood all over her face. And she saves humanity and the gods from this demon. And so her story is very frightening. It frightened the other gods. It frightened humanity to see this. But the imagery really, if you dig deep into it, it shows us a pathway towards our own shadow work. The death that Kali represents is not death of people. She never kills any people. In all of her stories, she only killed demons. But it's the death of our ego and the death of our fears, the death of our persona, that mask that we wear that hides the true self. She destroys our illusion of separateness. And her lesson to us is that everything we see outside of ourselves is us. Now, this is perfect for our shadow work. Those of you who are engaged in shadow work know that part of this is discovering that that is true, that the things that are outside of you are reflections of what is going on inside. Now, she looks scary in imagery. Like I said, she's often got her tongue out and she's covered in blood. But she's actually a very compassionate goddess when you work with her. She offers us the greatest gift that there is, and that's the liberation from our fears. And she shows us that our fear is just an illusion because our true self can never be destroyed. And essentially, that's the realization that we are searching for at the end of our shadow work anyway. So, a question to kind of think about, especially if you're someone who has a lot of fears and you feel that your fears are kind of in the way of your work, Kali is a very good one to choose. Here's a kind of a rhetorical question to ask yourself, but imagine what it would be like if you could be free of all of your fears. And that is a gift that working with Kali promises us. So if you are interested in learning more about Kali, I definitely recommend doing some research. If it sounds like she's kind of sparked an interest in you, check her out because, like I said, she's a great one for just kind of liberating us from our fears. And sometimes even those fears are fears of our own self. And that fear gets in the way of us even being able to begin the shadow work journey in the first place. So she can be actually a really great goddess to work with as you're beginning the journey, but any other point on it as well. And somebody's in the chat, they said, what goddess are we talking about? So this first one is Kali, and her name is spelled Kali. Some people call her Kali. She's a Hindu goddess. All right, so I am going to move next to Inanna, and we actually kind of get 8 tonight because Inanna comes with her sister Erishkigal. We're actually going to talk about both of those right now. Now, both Inanna and Erishkigal are Mesopotamian goddesses. Inanna is thought to be the goddess of love and war, which sometimes seems like it doesn't go together, but it does in much of the myth. She's a goddess of fertility, and most people will refer to her as the Queen of Heaven. Now, she's a very interesting goddess because she has many associations with other deities. So, for example, she's often associated with Aphrodite. We have that connection of her as being like a love goddess, a goddess of the heavens. She is often connected with Demeter and Persephone, and we're going to see in a moment when we learn a bit more about Inanna's myth, we're going to see why that makes sense. Inanna descended twice in her stories. Once she descended from heaven to earth, so as the Queen of Heaven, she came down to be on earth. And so there's even associations in Catholicism and other Christian sects that connect her to Mary, to the Mother Mary, who comes down to earth as well. Now, Inanna's second descent was when she descended from earth into the underworld, and that is the part of the story that is so important for our shadow work. Now, the underworld was the domain of her sister Erishkigal. Now, Erishkigal is often demonized in many stories, but if we look at what is actually going on, we understand that she's not quite the demon that some of the stories make her out to be. And I know that there are many people who are very interested in working with Lilith. We're not actually talking about her tonight, but if you guys enjoy this episode, I will do a new one in the future that includes her. But there are connections between Lilith and Erishkigal. Some say that Lilith's very first origination is in the story of Erishkigal. Now, like I said, Erishkigal was the goddess of the underworld, and Inanna knew nothing about the underworld. She was the goddess of heaven. And so there's quite a bit of jealousy between Erishkigal and Inanna because of that. But Inanna's brother Utu died at one point, and she wanted to go to his funeral, and they were holding the funeral in the underworld. So Inanna decided that she would descend down into the underworld in order to pay her respects for her brother. And so she put on all of her fancy clothes and jewels, and she starts to descend down into the underworld. But Erishkigal was very mad. She hated her sister. And so she decided to make it pretty much next to impossible to get down into the underworld. And so she set up these stations, these gates that Inanna would have to move through in order to get further into the underworld. And at each of these gates, Inanna had to remove something that connected her to the world above. And so at some of these, she would take off a piece of clothing. When she gets to one gate, she takes off a jewel that's at her throat. And what's very interesting is there are 7 gates and there are 7 chakras. And so these 7 gates actually represent the 7 chakras that we work with when we are working energetically. They allow us to get deeper into our own unconscious. And so what we discover with this story, just here in the beginning, the story is actually the story of descending into the unconscious for our shadow work. So as Inanna removed each of these pieces, I think in the beginning, Erishkigal thought that Inanna wouldn't actually do it, but Inanna did it. And finally, she took off the final piece of clothing and she arrives at that final gate and she's completely naked when she stands before Erishkigal and she finally gets to the underworld. Now, what's interesting is shadow work is a newer concept compared to this myth. This myth is thousands of years old, but the shadow work itself is probably only within the past 150 years or so. This idea, or this word, shadow work, has come into commonplace language. But there, you could see this obvious connection between this ancient myth and this newer work that people are doing. And we all must descend to face our shadow at some point. And in many respects, Erishkigal represents our shadow. She represented Inanna's shadow. She wasn't necessarily just her sister. She was everything that Inanna was not. And that is exactly what our shadow is. So this is the pathway to our spiritual evolution, is when we're able to descend down into the unconscious and face what's there. Now, Carl Jung, often thought to be the kind of godfather of shadow work, he said we should not fear that descent. And that's what Inanna's story can help us do, is we can actually enact that in meditation or in other places in order to kind of let go of some of that fear. So Jung said, do not fear that descent, because we know that it's always followed by an ascent out of the underworld, out of the unconscious. And when we do that, we assimilate the shadow and we're no longer controlled by it, which means we have gained power over the things that once seemed like they had power over us. And from this perspective, Inanna's descent is actually a descent into wisdom and understanding. Now, when she finally was able to face her sister Erishkigal in the underworld, Erishkigal got really pissed and she basically killed her. She forced her then to hang in the underworld for, some say, a few days, some say up to a week or a month. And this also represents our own shadow work journey, because we too must hang there in some place where as we start to face our shadow, we hang in the underworld as well. It could be a very dark and a long time when that's going on, when we're doing this kind of work, but we all ascend out of the underworld, and that is essentially the promise of shadow work, and we're never the same again. So if you're interested in the goddesses Inanna and or Erishkigal, you can work with both of them, as Inanna kind of representing yourself, Erishkigal representing your shadow. Some people might choose to work with just Inanna or just Erishkigal. But if you are interested in those, definitely do some more research. Great goddesses to work with, especially if you're doing chakra work in connection to your shadow work as well, because there's that whole connection to the chakras as Inanna descends down into the underworld. All right, so next I'm going to talk about Chiron. Chiron is one of my personal favorites. He is not necessarily a god, but he is half mortal and half god, or half divine. Now, Homer, the great poet Homer, said that Chiron was the wisest and the justest of all the centaurs. Chiron was half man, he was half horse, he was half mortal and half divine. Now, his story of origin is very painful. He is the product of Kronos and a sea nymph named Philyra. And Kronos was searching, so anybody who knows much about the story, at some point Kronos was searching for Zeus so that he could kill him, because he had had a premonition that one of his own children would destroy him eventually. So he was trying to find Zeus, and on one of his escapades trying to find Zeus, he came across Philra, and she was so beautiful that he had to have her. And he was actually trying to hide from his own wife, Rhea. And so during that time, he transformed himself into a horse, raped Philra, and out of this is the conception of Chiron. So unfortunately, when Chiron was born, he was born a centaur, half horse. Philra was horrified that she had a son who was half horse. She abandoned him. And of course, Kronos went off searching for Zeus and abandoned him as well. And eventually, Chiron was found by Apollo and Artemis, who raised him. And from very early on, Chiron was very gifted in medicine. He studied herbs, and he was very, very gifted at healing others, so people would come to him for help. Now, he was also a very good friend of Heracles, and during Heracles' fourth labor, he visited a centaur called Pholus. And during this story, they were drinking wine, and the story basically says that while Heracles and Chiron and Pholus were drinking this wine, they kind of opened it up, and the wine made all of the other centaurs set them into a frenzy. And there's something about centaurs, they really like to drink. They really like to drink a lot. And so they just smelled this wine and they went crazy. And so they kind of start this fight that isn't really meant to kill anybody. It's just a sort of a fight between drunk people, essentially, between drunk centaurs, and Heracles is there. And so during all of this commotion and chaos, Chiron is wounded by an arrow that had been dipped in poison. It was shot by his friend Heracles. And the unfortunate part is that that poison, it would have killed anybody. But because Chiron was half mortal and half god, he could not be killed. So he lived with this excruciating pain, but he could never die. And in day after day and week after week, year after year, he searched for the cure for his agonizing pain. And during this time, he learned more about medicine, and he became an even greater and more gifted healer. And so what his story really tells us is this is all about the archetype of the wounded healer. Now, Chiron had two wounds. Many of us have multiple wounds throughout our lives. He had two: one when his parents abandoned him, and two when he was shot by his friend's arrow that left him with this agonizing pain. But he turned to the healing arts in an attempt to heal himself, but he ended up also being able to heal others. So what this tells us is that when we heal, well, we can't help but heal others as well. One thing is that we show them it's possible when we start to do good things for ourselves. And many of you, those of you who have engaged in shadow work, I've heard you tell stories about someone says to you, I want something, I want more of what you're doing. I want to know what you're doing because you seem to be in a much better place since you began this work. So we show them this work is possible. Our pain also makes it easier for us to understand the pain of others as well. And this story illustrates the idea of homeopathy, which is that there is poison. Within poison, there's often a cure. So we must face our poison, our pain, and not ignore it if we intend to heal it. Chiron helps us face our own wound, and then we can begin to heal through that. So he is a great one to work with, especially if you feel that there's some kind of a salient wound that you are trying to heal. So if you have abandonment issues like Chiron from when you were a young child, or if you have physical illness or mental illness or something that you feel that stands in your kind of way of moving forward with your spiritual evolution, Chiron's a great one to choose to work with. All right, just saying hi to those of you who are joining us. So I'm going to move to number 4 now. This is Skadi. Her name is spelled Skadi. And I will go back because I know the names of some of these are a little bit hard to spell. I'm going to go back later and I'm going to put in all of the 1 through 7 that I talked about. Okay, so you'll have all the spellings. But this is Skadi, Skadi. Now, she is a Norse goddess. So we're actually going to talk about her and then Odin next as our 5th one. Skadi is the goddess of winter and the mountains. And on the surface, she's not necessarily one that people might think right away when they think about shadow work. So a lot of our shadow work deities are deities of the underworld, they're deities of death, right? We talked about Kali in the beginning, a deity of death, and then we talked about Inanna and Erishkigal, so that connection to the underworld. But Skadi, she is a goddess of the mountains, in fact, and the mountains in winter. Now, she is also a goddess of water. And what I like about that connection is that she connects us to the sacral chakra and she connects us to our emotions. Our emotions very much have to do with our shadow work because when we are facing those things that trouble us, we're facing those very difficult things, sometimes our emotions get in the way and they cloud our ability to see what's actually there. So when we can work with a deity that's connected to water or connected to our emotions, it can kind of help us clear that, almost like murky, cloudy water that then becomes more clear. Now, Skadi's name is also interesting where it originates from. So it originates from, a couple different translations. So some say it means it translates to the word harm. And then others say it comes from the Gothic word "goddess," which translates to shadow. So what's interesting is that when you put those two together, harm equals shadow. And so our shadow is, not necessarily that the shadow is going to harm us, because remember, it's a part of us. But we may not be able to step into our fullest power. I shouldn't say we may not be able to, we won't be able to step into our fullest power if our shadow is clouding our way, right? And blocking our way from being able to see our true self. So ultimately, we will be harmed if we do not explore that shadow self. Now, Skadi was a giantess before she was a goddess. She later made a goddess, but the giants themselves were associated with darkness and cold and the shadows. They were up in the mountaintops. After Skadi's father died, she inherited his land that included a castle way up in a forest in the farthest reaches of the mountains. And there she lives in the fortress of her own inner winter. And I think this is an important connection for us to kind of make about that as well. So our own inner winter are periods of time that we go through that are when feel that we're at kind of like our darkest. So some might say this is our dark night of the soul. So, if you think back in your life, you can probably think back to several times where, things were just at their darkest, right? I can think all the way back to like when I was 22 and I was in a relationship that was not good. I don't know what I was doing in it. But I remember there's this one point we went to a concert. I went to Berklee College of Music, and we went to a concert there right around Christmas time. And I remember being in the bathroom, like at intermission of this concert, and looking in the mirror, and I could barely recognize myself because I looked like I had aged like decades. I was only 22 at the time. And so when I think back of periods of inner winter, that is definitely a period of mine. So these periods are these periods of pain and sadness, darkness, and often, they hold a charge for us that continues even after they're over. So they're usually places for us to go back and explore. So even that story I was telling you about when I was 22, even though that's gone, that's long over, that relationship's gone. I feel like I've learned a lot from it. I feel like I've done a lot of healing. But if there still remains any charge at all, like any charge, emotional charge, that basically suggests there's places that we still can work. Because what it does is when we leave parts of ourselves behind like that, um, it's basically means that we don't have all the energy we need to move forward into our future. So Skadi is a great goddess to work with because she can help us kind of help usher us through those painful memories, help us look at them more deeply, see if there's more things to learn, see if there's like I said, that emotional charge that's left over that we can let go of. And then our goal would be to release some of that. Skadi allows us to work through these very painful periods. So if you are somebody who has those kind of periods of inner winter, or if you're in one right now too, like some people have seasonal affective disorder, and that was something I definitely discovered about myself. Is when I was living in Boston, those cold winters really got to me, and I felt a lot better when I moved to California. But if you're somebody who goes through, cycles of feeling very down and very low and feeling very dark, Skadi might be a good goddess for you to work with, because she can kind of help us reflect on those periods, but then pull ourselves out of them. All right, so from there, I'm going to move to Odin. So Odin is also a Norse god. He's a great one to work with for different aspects of our shadow work. And I know he's a very popular god too, so there may be people in here in the chat who have worked with him before. Now, um, the Norse god Odin is sometimes called Woden in Old English. He is has many different names, often referred to as the All Father, and he's often portrayed as having only one eye. His eye was sacrificed in order to gain knowledge, and he's often visualized as having a very long beard, wearing a long cloak. So sometimes people might even look at the Hermit card of the tarot and associate with Odin, though that's more associated with someone like Saturn. Definitely looking at the Hanged Man in the tarot deck, especially if you work with tarot, you can kind of connect to Odin that way and connect to this archetype of the Hanged Man. Now, Odin usually is seen carrying a spear, and he's often accompanied by several familiars. So sometimes his two wolves, sometimes his two ravens, Hunin and Munin. Now, Hunin represents thought, and Munin represents memory. And these birds always flew around him and would bring him messages from other parts of the world and bring them back to Odin. Now, the story that I think of Odin's that really most connects to our shadow work is the story of his hanging from the tree Yggdrasil. This is the world tree, and Odin, for those who are not familiar with the story, Odin sacrificed himself by hanging on this tree in order to gain knowledge. So some say this was the knowledge of life and death, and some even say this is the knowledge of runes, because in some of the stories, while he was hanging suspended upside down, blood from his own wound, he was wounded by his own spear, blood from his own wound fell to the earth, and when it hit the earth, it created the runes. Now, he hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, a very significant number in mythology. And during that time, he saw many, many visions, and he received secret wisdom, so that when he was finally able to leave the tree, he left a different person. He left with all of this knowledge that he didn't know. He knew how to cure the sick when he left the tree. He knew how to calm down storms. He knew how to turn weapons against his attackers. Some stories say he could make any woman fall in love with him. So he was that powerful when he left that tree. Now, some say that that in essence, his sacrifice of himself was the ultimate offering for wisdom, and so this really resonates very deeply with us in our own shadow work stories. So, what can this story teach us about shadow work? Well, what we know is that the greatest wisdom that there is lies within us. It's not outside of us. It's not in books. It's not in teachers. It's not in outside sources. It's in us. Now, all those things can guide us and lead us to the right path. And some of the best teachers and the best books won't just tell you what to do. Won't just heal you. They will actually tell you how to heal yourself, or assist you in how to heal yourself. So we too should consider this when we feel that there are times when we're kind of hanging, right? So you may think that sometimes all these things are kind of being done to you, and you're feeling that everything's going wrong. And this can be an invitation to really look at what's going on in our lives and see if we can see those patterns. And maybe it's an invitation even to hang on that tree and in a kind of a meditative state, and just let our blood fall down to the earth and let the wisdom pour out of us, in a figurative sense. So we can ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice, or what can we sacrifice for our own wisdom? Odin is very great to work with in our shadow work because he encourages us to do that inner reflection that is required of our shadow work. So if you're someone who, especially if you feel that you're kind of in a place where you are being pulled inward, you might notice that you're not as feeling as sociable and not wanting to be around as many people. Odin might be a great god to work with because it's an invitation to turn inward and kind of see what lies there. All right, so again, if you guys are here live, feel free to leave questions, comments in the chat. We're going to do a Q&A at the end, and it does not have to be about deities. It could be about anything you want to ask. All right, so I'm going to move on to number 6. So number 6 is a personal favorite of mine. So this is Kore, spelled Kore. I actually have a kitten. She's not a kitten anymore. She's 2 years old, but her name is Kore because I love this story so much, and her and my kitten's life kind of reminds me of the story of Kore. So Kore is, some believe, the Romanized name for the goddess Persephone. But in reality, Kore is actually when you translate the word Kore, Kore or Kora, so sometimes it's pronounced Kora, it actually translates to the word girl. And so, in fact, Kore is the name for the generic statue of a girl in Greek art. Now, in general, the statue would represent like youth. There's a male version of it as well that is called Koros, and it's basically the kind of the epitome of male youth, and the Kora would be the epitome of female youth. But many connect the word actually to the persona of Persephone before she was abducted by Hades. So she is the girl who Persephone was before the tragic events that would happen to her. And I'm going to tell more about that story for those who don't know it. So in this respect, what Kore does is she connects us to our inner child. And our inner child is very important in our shadow work. So Kore, for those who don't know the myth, Kore is, let's go to Persephone. So the story says basically that Kore, in the version of Persephone before she was abducted, was one day she was picking flowers in a meadow, very happy. And Hades, the god of the underworld, saw her, and he decided that he had to have her. And so in some of the stories, it says that he asked Demeter, her mother, for her hand. And of course, Demeter said no. Kore was like a little kid, essentially, in some of these myths, or at least a very young teenager. And so, heartbroken, he decides to abduct her, and he brought her to the underworld. In some myths, he didn't even bother asking for Demeter. He just basically took her, and he tricked her into staying by offering her pomegranate seeds. And pomegranate, well, anything that you eat in the underworld will keep you there. And so this was part of the trick. So by eating food in the underworld, she couldn't leave. So Demeter didn't know where she was in the beginning. She was wandering the earth, just madly trying to find her daughter. And eventually she realized what had happened. She was very furious. And so she demanded that Kore be returned to her. But because Kore had eaten those seeds, she couldn't leave. And Demeter was so pissed off by this. And so she did basically was like, if I don't get her back, I'm just going to take away all of my energy from the earth, and I'm the earth goddess. So there's not going to be any fertile earth anymore. And so this goes on for a while, but she demanded the release until she got her Persephone or Kore back. She was not going to bring her energy back to the earth. Now Zeus became very alarmed because he realized that the earth couldn't be fallow like that for very long. The green earth had to come back, and in order for that to happen, they had to have Demeter's okay. And so he decided to intervene, and he made this deal. He struck up this deal between Kore and Persephone and Hades and Demeter and everyone involved, and basically said that Kore, as Persephone, could return to the earth during the spring, and she'd be there all during the spring and the summer, and then that would bring back all the greenness to the earth. But then she would have to descend down into the underworld in the fall and stay there from fall to winter. So on the surface, just on the surface, obviously this myth explains the changing of the seasons. But Kore is also a powerful example of the inner child. And so when we work with her, in her form as Cori, not in her form as Persephone, she connects us to our own inner child. Now, while most of us were not abducted by the Lord of the Underworld, thank God, many of us have experienced some pretty traumatic things when we were children. And so, even those who did not experience traumatic events may have been in families and where they didn't really get what they needed as a child. So we all have these inner child wounds to work with, and Cori can help us connect to that part of ourselves, to our own inner child, and to begin to heal some of those wounds. At the very least, when we connect to the inner child, we start to kind of make a relationship with that aspect of ourselves, which is very beneficial for our shadow work, because our shadow began to develop when we were very small children, before we had even could speak, before we had any idea that something like this would eventually exist, that we would all have to heal. So if we can keep our inner child happy, we are more likely to have the cooperation of the inner child when we're on that shadow work journey. So Cori, especially if you're somebody who wants to do inner child work, she would be a goddess that I would definitely recommend looking into. And again, not really working with the Persephone aspect of her as the queen of the underworld. That is a totally different aspect that we could do a different episode. She can include her in the next episode. But we work with Cori, we work with that child before it was wounded, and it can aid us in kind of gaining the trust of our own inner child so that we can further our shadow work. Okay, and then finally, I am going to end here with the Morrigan. So the Morrigan is a great goddess for shadow work, one that I had not worked with very much, though we did work with her a few months ago in our Shadow Seekers membership. And I know from talking to other people in our membership, and I know my own experience with working with this goddess in this particular ritual we did, it was life altering. Like, my life totally changed after that ritual. So let me tell you a little bit about the Morrigan, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we did in that ritual. So the Morrigan is a great goddess of the Celts. She is thought to be a warrior goddess and a death goddess, both of which very much align her with our shadow work. She is a goddess of fate. Oftentimes she's viewed as a triple goddess, uh, though though there is kind of some question about, is she really the type of triple goddess that we see in traditional witchcraft or in Wicca? Not necessarily. I'm going to get back to that in a second. But the very first mention of the Morrigan is probably all the way back in 700 BC, though some believe that her presence exists even before that. It's just that the Celtic people didn't actually write down very much, so we don't know much about anything before around that 700 BC mark. Her name translates to Great Queen, and she is considered a shapeshifter. She is a goddess of ravens and crows. She is a goddess of wolves. She could shapeshift into an eel in some stories, into a horse, and she could shapeshift into either a young or an old woman, a woman in any kind of area or part of her life cycle. Now, like I said, she's often referred to as triple goddess, but it's not really that traditional maiden, mother, and crone that we've come to expect from the traditional triple goddess. Really, the Morrigan can be thought of as three aspects, or three sisters, the daughters of Ernmis, and they are referred collectively as the Morrigan. Now, sometimes she's associated with Morgan Le Fay, though there's no historical support for this. It's probably more likely that Morgan Le Fay's character from the Arthurian legends was inspired by this Celtic goddess. The Morrigan is also a goddess of sovereignty, and that is the aspect. Well, there's many ways that you can work with her in your shadow work, but that's the aspect that we chose to work with in our ritual. And so the sovereignty that we are talking about here is this idea of how sovereign do you feel in your own life? So do you feel that you have control? Can you take the reins? Can you make the changes that you need to make? Or do you feel that you're controlled by other people? And so the Morrigan very much invites us to find our own sovereignty, to answer the question of, where do you play small in your life, or where do you play little? Where are you giving away your power? So if you feel that there's a situation in your life where you're giving away power, where you're not standing up into your, bigger self, or you're kind of shrinking away, or feel like you're being kind of erased in situations, the Morrigan can be a very good one to work with, because as a warrior goddess, she kind of instills that warrior energy in us. Calling her in, bringing her into our presence allows us to open up more to that energy, and to really stand up and answer that question: where in your life do you feel like you're playing small? And I know for me, it was very transformative to work with her and ask that question, because I realized it was in my own work experience. And literally after that ritual, I quit my job, and I was able to maintain all the clients that, most of the clients that I had in my previous job. They kind of followed me after I quit. And now I'm making more money and working less hours. So is in what I realized too is like a domino effect, because once you kind of take back your power in one place, you start to take back it in other places as well. So great goddess to work with, especially if you find there's a place where you kind of need to step into your power, you need sovereignty, you kind of stand up for yourself, and great goddess to work with. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not an exhaustive list, and if you enjoy, if there's a goddess that you love or a god that you love that isn't on this list, send me a message or put it in the comments, and if I get enough requests, I will do another episode like this. I'll just choose 7 different ones. And of course, if you are interested in learning more about any of these gods or goddesses that we talked about tonight, do some research on it. If one's kind of tapping you on the shoulder, do a little research on it, and see what comes up. And just the very first step to do is just sort of make the decision to work with that god or that goddess, and then let that sort of open up and lead you. All right, so I am going to now open it up for the Q&A. So if you are here, if you would like to leave any questions or comments here, I'm going to answer anything you've got. If you want to know more about any of these gods or goddesses I just asked about, you can ask about that, or anything related to shadow work, witchcraft, energy work. Doesn't have to specifically be work related to deities. So I'm going to give some space to put questions in the comments now. And while you're doing that, I am going to tell you a little bit about what's coming up. So next week, I'm going to be doing an episode on the heart chakra. So the heart chakra is the bridge between the spiritual and the ethereal, between kind of the body and the spirit. It's a place where we get a lot of constriction and kind of stuck and stagnant energy, because pretty much all of us have had kind of painful events that have happened that kind of get lodged in the heart. And sometimes we don't even realize. We think we've moved through kind of that pain and that grief, but some of it stays there. And so if we can work to move the energy in the heart chakra, what we effectively do is we open up the energy channels that move from our lower chakras up into our upper chakras. If we have restrictions here in the center, what we do is we block that area. So even if we want to become more intuitive, we can't, because we have those blockages in the chakras below. A lot of times that's stuck right here in the heart. So we're going to talk all about that next week. And then after that, on the 22nd of November, that's the day right before Thanksgiving, I have a very special episode. So we're not actually going to go live like this. I'm going to be doing a live Zoom workshop called Introduction to Shadow Work. Some of you have probably taken it. If you have taken it, just know that you can take it again. I change it up every time a little bit. But for anybody who hasn't taken it, it's a really great workshop. It'll teach you all about the shadow self, how to do shadow work. It'll give you some techniques on how to do it. And then after that workshop, we're going to be opening up our Shadow Seekers membership to take in some new members. So watch for invites on how you can get the Zoom link for that workshop on the 22nd. It's free. Everybody's invited. And for those who can't come live, there will be a replay. We're also going to stream it from the Zoom. So you can come live, so you can actually interact with me. You can ask questions and things, but you can also watch it as it gets streamed over to the Facebook page as well. So that is what is coming up. So look forward to that. And let's see here. So I see a lot of people here. Hi, guys. I see Cindy and Melinda, Colleen, Jen. Hi, everybody. Leslie. Rebecca, Anthony, Jenny. Hi, everybody. So I see Cindy was talking about the goddess Bendis, who I know that she had heard her name spoken during her sleep. And you said so far she's called you in your sleep a total of 3 times. That's really exciting. So yeah, so she definitely seems like a great goddess to work with, especially when a goddess is kind of tapping us on the shoulder. It's a good indication that this is one that wants to work with us. So I would do as much research as I can about her, and then I think we talked about this before, but even potentially setting up an altar, leave an offering to her if you'd like. She's often connected to Artemis, so like a goddess of the hunt. And then I see that I know Anthony's been working with Lilith, so he said, any quick thoughts on Lilith? So I can add her to a future episode. I think I mentioned to you, Lilith is some say her origins go all the way back to Babylon, to Babylonian times, but others say it goes even further back into Mesopotamia, and there's some deep connections between her and Erishkigal. In fact, some think that Lilith may have kind of developed out of those who were worshiping Erishkigal. But Lilith is a great goddess for working with shadow work. So I think it really, as far as thoughts on her, I mean, you could do a whole episode on her. So you have to be specific about what you're wondering about. But like with any deity, I think that one of the best things to do is just once you open up your kind of energy to working with them, it's like an invitation out into the universe. So you send that invitation out that you're open to working with them. And then from there, what I usually like to do is create an altar where I leave offerings for that deity kind of all the time, or I have something on that altar at any time when I'm working with them, but then particularly working with them during specific parts of the lunar cycle. So a lot of these deities that we've talked about tonight, not all of them, but a lot of them, and including Lilith, are deities that are, kind of have those darker aspects to them. And so they actually are very good to work with when we kind of enter that final 7 days of the lunar cycle, which we're actually in right now. On Friday, we enter the balsamic moon. The balsamic moon is the last 72 hours of the lunar phase. This is a time when we're most receptive to like the energy. It's like a time every lunar cycle, where the veils thin a little bit. So it's good to do divination during that time. It's good to kind of work with some of these darker deities. So it would be a good time to do a ritual to any one of these as we're kind of approaching that balsamic moon. So like I said, for this particular cycle, it will start on Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday is the dark moon. So that would be the like the deepest place, right? So we, in our own Shadow Seekers membership, that's when we do our rituals, is because we know that's the most receptive time for doing healing work. So anybody like Anthony working with Lilith, or Cindy's been working with Bendis, you could try to do something, or anybody who wants to work with one of these deities we talked about, you could try to do something at the dark moon, and you'll be more open and receptive to working with that kind of healing energy, and also you'll be more open and receptive to kind of messages that are coming through about from your unconscious, essentially. And that's what we're trying to get at when we're doing our shadow work, is what's coming through from the unconscious. So I hope that helps. But if you have any specific questions, put them in the chat. And I don't see anything else here, and I didn't have any that were sent to me this week. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off now. But if I miss anybody's questions, I will go back through the chat later. And if you are watching this in replay, feel free to put questions here too. I go back later and I answer everyone's questions. Okay, I will look forward to seeing you guys next week, and then in 2 weeks, hopefully I'll see some of you live at the Zoom class. All right, until next time, blessed be.